Hey guys, tonight we sink into the chill of a medieval winter, where you, a peasant with cracked hands and a patched cloak, feel the icy breath of December creeping through the gaps in your cottage walls. The wind rattles the wooden shutters like impatient fingers, and smoke from your hearth curls thick and stingy because there's barely enough fuel to keep it burning. Outside, the fields that once swayed with barley are now barren, hidden under frost. The streams you used to splash your face in are frozen, a mirror of pale glass under the wan moonlight. Your stomach growls in the silence of the room, because food in this season is not something you take for granted. It is a shadow that hovers over you, a question that wakes you in the night. You probably won't survive this, at least not without a little cunning and a lot of luck. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know where you are in the world and what time it is for you right now. I always love seeing who's listening and when. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge out of bed at dawn, though dawn hardly means light in midwinter, just a bluish haze over the horizon. The first thought on your mind isn't prayer or chores, it's whether there's enough to eat. Your larder, if you can even call it that, is little more than a wooden chest with a few sacks tucked inside. Some flour, a couple of onions, maybe a hunk of cheese if you've been lucky. Unlike the nobles who dine on roasted swan in halls, you rely on what was harvested back in September. Those sacks of grain, dried beans, and stored roots are the thin line between life and starvation. The dread creeps in when you realize that every handful you scoop out is a countdown clock. Winter is long, sometimes 6 months of scraping by, and the food supply must be carefully rationed. Historians still argue whether peasants in the high Middle Ages were perpetually malnourished or simply accustomed to a narrower diet. Some suggest that the average caloric intake was shockingly high when harvests were good, close to what modern athletes eat. Others argue that's nonsense, pointing out that famine was never more than a failed harvest away. Whatever the truth, you feel it in your belly, the gnawing question of whether tomorrow's bread will be thinner than today's. You chew a crust of rye bread left over from yesterday. It's hard as a brick, but you soak it in weak ale until it softens. The taste is sour, a little smoky from the hearth, and your teeth ache as you gnaw through it. Yet this humble bread is the foundation of your survival. Roughly 3/4 of your calories come from grain, whether as bread, porridge, or gruel. That's the boring, honest truth. Medieval peasants weren't living off spit-roasted hogs every night. They were chewing on dark bread and thin soups, day in and day out. And here's the quirky bit. Some bread was baked so coarse that archaeologists have found bits of grit from millstones embedded in the crumbs, meaning you'd literally grind down your teeth eating it. Medieval dentistry, yeah, you don't want to imagine it. But winter's dread isn't just about taste, it's about scarcity. You remember last year when the harvest failed after heavy rains. The fields turned to mud, and instead of neat stacks of wheat, you had soggy nothingness. That year, the villagers made bark bread, stripping the inner layer of trees, grinding it to powder, and mixing it into flour. It was bitter, fibrous, and barely food, but it stretched the dwindling supply. Some folk muttered about curses, about God testing them, while others quietly remembered how wolves came closer to the edge of the village. Survival meant improvising, and sometimes improvising meant humiliation at the dinner table. Tonight, though, you're lucky. The last autumn wasn't disastrous. You have grain, salted scraps of pork, and a few cabbages stored in the cellar. Still, every bite is tinged with worry. Each spoonful of stew, each crust broken between your fingers, is haunted by the knowledge that it might have to last until May. Even the church calendar is both a comfort and a curse. Feast days bring relief, but fasting days strip away precious calories. You mutter a prayer to Saint Bridget, patron of households, hoping she keeps the mice away from your grain sack. You know that one family down the lane already lost their winter stores to rats. And that's the reality. You can't run to the market when your cupboard is bare. The market itself might be barren. By candlelight, you watch your children gnawing their bread. Their cheeks are thin, their hair rough from lack of oils. You smile anyway, forcing warmth into the room, because in these winters, morale is as important as food. The stories you tell, the jokes you share, like calling the watery ale liquid courage help mask the hunger, is survival too. You joke that the bread is so hard it could double as a roof tile, but you keep chewing anyway. And the dread isn't only about hunger, it's also about illness. With weakened bodies and poor diets, winter sickness spreads fast. A neighbor coughs himself into the grave, and you wonder whether his stew lacked onions or whether the frost spirits got him. There's always a mix of superstition and science in your thoughts. Garlic, for example, is both food and medicine, and you hope the little stash you braided and hung from the rafters will last through the cold. You lie down on straw bedding, belly not quite full but not empty either. The fire flickers, smoke drifting into the rafters. Outside, a wolf howls in the distance. Your eyes close, but the dread hums in your chest. Will the bread last? Will the cheese mold? Will the salted pork keep until spring? Tomorrow you'll ration again, count again, worry again. And in that rhythm of dread and hope, you drift into uneasy dreams. You wake with the cold gnawing at your toes, the straw mattress stiff with frost where your breath has settled overnight. Your first thought is not of chores, not of church bells, but of bread. The loaf sits there on the wooden board, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, looking more like a lump of clay than something edible. You cut into it, the knife dragging through the dense, dark crumb, and you can almost hear your teeth protesting in advance. This is rye bread, maybe mixed with barley or oats, whatever you had enough of to mill back in harvest time. It is heavy, sour, and filling in a way that makes your stomach stop complaining, but never truly satisfied. This bread is your lifeline. Without it, there is nothing. Historians still argue whether peasants were truly dependent on rye because wheat was too costly, or whether regions varied so much that some villages had white loaves while others only ever saw coarse brown ones. What's clear, though, is that for you, the daily loaf is the difference between life and death. And if the flour runs out, you're in trouble. You remember how some desperate folk once mixed in pea flour or ground up chestnuts to stretch their dough. That made the bread dense as stone but edible, well, sort of. The oven in your village is communal. It's a massive, dome-shaped structure built of clay and stone, and families take turns baking their loaves. The oven master, usually a stern widow with arms like tree trunks, watches closely so no one sneaks in more bread than their allotted share. You carry your little lump of dough, already knowing it'll come back darker, and then when you handed it in. The heat of the oven licks at your face as you place it on the hot stones, and you think of how these loaves must last days, sometimes weeks. That's why the bread is baked so dense. It's not meant to be soft and fluffy, it's meant to endure. You chew slowly, dipping the crust in a wooden cup of ale to soften it. The taste is sour, faintly smoky, and yes, a little gritty. That grit isn't seasoning, it's stone dust from the millstones that ground your flour. Archaeologists find medieval skeletons with teeth worn down like sandpaper, proof that each meal was a dental hazard. You chuckle to yourself. Forget about braces or whitening strips. In your world, the problem is just keeping teeth in your head until 40. The bread is never eaten alone. A smear of lard if you're lucky, maybe a bit of garlic across the surface for. Sometimes you crumble a chunk into hot broth, letting it soak until it's soft enough to spoon. The children like that best. It feels more like a meal than dry crust. On feast days, a loaf might even be stuffed with meat or herbs, though that's a rare luxury, like finding a coin in the mud. You hear old folks in the village whisper about miracle loaves, those that never run out if blessed properly. Some tell of holy women who baked bread that fed hundreds, proof that divine could stretch a crust into a feast. Of course, in your reality, miracles don't often happen. Bread shrinks, bread disappears, bread goes stale. And yet each morning you're grateful for it. Without this sour, heavy lump, you'd be gnawing on bark. Bread has its own rhythm, its own calendar. Grain has to be sown, harvested, dried, threshed, milled, kneaded, baked. If any part of that chain fails, if the rains flood the fields, if the miller cheats on the weight, if the oven cracks, your whole winter suffers. You think of last summer's fields, golden and swaying under the August sun, and you realize those moments were your future meals waving at you. No harvest then, no bread now. Simple as that. Sometimes, if you're daring, you dream of white bread, the kind nobles eat. It's soft, pale, almost cake-like compared to your rye, but you know it's rare to see such loaves outside the manor kitchen. The miller saves the fine flour for lords and priests. You get the bran-heavy stuff, dark and coarse. You grumble, but deep down you know that your rough bread actually keeps better through the winter. White bread molds, spoils easier. Maybe, just maybe, your sour rye is the better survival tool, even if your jaw aches after every meal. You lean back, licking crumbs from your fingers, and joke with your neighbor that the bread could double as a hammer. He laughs, showing the gap where two molars used to be. Helps, it always does. You tell the children to be grateful, reminding them that the loaf might not last if they're greedy. They roll their eyes, but they obey. They've already learned that in winter, even a hard crust is treasure. So you chew another mouthful, sip your ale, and tuck the loaf carefully back under its cloth. Tomorrow it will be smaller, the day after smaller still. But for now, the bread keeps you alive, and the sour taste lingers in your mouth like a reminder. Life in these winters is simple. If you have bread, you endure. Without it, you crumble, then the crust you bite into. The morning frost lingers in the corners of the cottage, your breath fogging the air as you poke at the embers in the hearth. The bread you chewed yesterday is still sitting like a rock in your belly, but it won't carry you through the long hours of ahead. That's where the pot hanging over the fire comes in. Inside is the simplest, most repetitive, and let's be honest, most soul-numbing dish in your winter life, gruel, or if you're lucky, porridge. You scoop a ladle of the thick, beige mush into a wooden bowl. Steam curls up, the scent earthy and faintly sour. The grains are barley, mostly, sometimes oats, sometimes millet if a neighbor traded you a sack. You chew slowly, the texture sticky and glue-like, the bland as wet cardboard. And yet this is the true workhorse of your diet, a dish so common it practically defined peasant survival. Historians still argue whether peasants hated it with a passion or embraced it as comfort food, but either way, you don't have much choice. You eat it because it fills you up enough to swing an axe, patch a roof, or haul wood. The process of making gruel is almost ritual. You pour in water, never plain from the stream, always boiled because the water might sicken you. Into the pot goes a handful of grain, maybe crushed with a mortar, maybe whole if you're in a rush. The mixture simmers for hours, thickening until it's hearty enough to spoon but still thin enough to stretch for multiple meals. A pinch of salt, if you can afford it, transforms it from tasteless to slightly less tasteless. Some families stir in a bit of lard or bacon drippings. If you really want to impress the kids, you drizzle in a spoon of honey, but that's a once-a-season miracle. There's a fringe tidbit whispered by. Some monasteries supposedly made luxury porridge with almond milk, saffron, and even sugar. You shake your head at the thought. For you, almond milk is as imaginary as dragons, and saffron might as well be moon dust. Your porridge is humble, grey, and repetitive. Still, it sticks to your ribs. The children slurp theirs noisily, and you can't help but laugh. You joke that it tastes better if you close your eyes and pretend it's stew. They giggle, spilling down their chins, but they eat every drop. Hunger makes even the dullest gruel taste like salvation. That's the secret of winter food context. When the snow piles at your door and your stomach twists with emptiness, a steaming bowl of mush can feel like a feast. In fact, porridge isn't just breakfast. It's lunch, it's supper, it's sometimes a midnight snack when the cold keeps you awake. You might eat it plain or break in a hunk of yesterday's bread, letting it soak until it dissolves. You might toss in a dried onion or shred a cabbage leaf if you've got one. Sometimes you even make pottage, the slightly fancier cousin of porridge, by tossing in beans, peas, or a chunk of meat if fortune smiles. But pottage is for the better days. Most days, it's the same gloopy, grainy, reliable mush. One odd detail, some families leave the porridge pot simmering all day, topping it up with water and more grain as needed. The deepens, turning into a kind of ever-changing stew that never truly ends. Archaeologists call this a perpetual stew, though you just call it dinner. You can't help but grin at the thought. One pot to rule them all, bubbling forever, slightly suspicious, but always ready. You pause between spoonfuls and think of the bigger picture. Grain is not just food, it's economy, it's power, it's taxes. The Lord takes his share in bushels, the miller charges his fee in handfuls, and by the time you get what's left, you're scraping the bottom. You eat porridge not because you love it, but because it's what the system allows you. Still, you can't deny that without it, you'd have no energy to face the bitter winds outside. You finish your bowl, licking the last sticky bits from your spoon. You joke that if you leave it too long, it'll harden into a weapon. The kids laugh, waving their spoons like swords. Again, your secret seasoning. Then, with your belly warmed and your limbs slightly steadier, you push aside the bowl and stand. The day's work calls, and though porridge is no feast, it's enough. Enough to keep you upright, enough to let you trudge through snow, enough to survive another day. And that really is the point. Because in this world, survival isn't about variety or pleasure. It's about scooping the same mushy porridge into the same bowl day after day, season after season, and telling yourself, quietly, stubbornly, that it's good enough. You step outside into the icy air, and the cold bites through your cloak like tiny knives. The snow crunches under your boots as you make your way toward the small shed where the family's most precious treasure is kept. Not gold, not silver, but meat. In the summer and autumn, you hardly think about it. But now, in the frozen heart of winter, every sliver of pork or beef feels like a miracle tucked away against the frost. Inside the shed, the smell hits you first. Sharp salt, tangy smoke, and the faint iron of blood. Hanging from wooden hooks are cuts of pork, what's left after the great autumn slaughter. This is the ritual every peasant knows. Come November, animals that cannot be kept through winter must be killed. Feeding them hay when fields are barren is impossible, so pigs and sometimes cattle are butchered. their flesh preserved to last until spring. The scene might have been grim, but in truth it was a celebration. The village gathered, knives sharpened, fires lit, laughter spilling as everyone worked together. Even the children played with pig bladders inflated into makeshift balls, their giggles echoing as the adults salted meat. It was, in a way, the medieval version of a holiday barbecue, just bloodier and with much higher stakes. You lift a piece of bacon from its hook. The fat glistens in the dim light, hard and white, with streaks of dark red meat. You slice off a sliver, chew slowly, and let the salty flood your mouth. It is tough, leathery, but bursting with life compared to yesterday's porridge. This is your protein, your muscle fuel. Without it, you weaken fast. Historians still argue whether peasants ate meat often or rarely. Some point to records of salted pork as proof it was common, while others insist it was reserved for special days. For you, the truth is simpler. The meat is there if you were able to slaughter in autumn, but by midwinter, the supply runs dangerously thin. You remember the smoking hut, a small building where fire smoldered for days under hanging cuts. The smoke curled up, darkening the meat, giving it that distinct tang you taste even now. The salt, expensive as it was, had to be deep into every surface. Without it, rot would creep in, and one spoiled slab could mean sickness or worse. You shiver, not from the cold this time, but from memory. Last year, a neighbor ate bad sausage and never woke again. That's the risk of preserved meat. It's both salvation and danger. But you still cling to it. Each strip of bacon, each chunk of salted beef, each dried sausage links you back to that autumn day when food was plentiful. Eating it now is like eating the memory of sunshine. You laugh quietly at the thought. Your dinner is nostalgia with a side of salt. Not all preservation is so neat. Sometimes you dry strips of meat in the attic rafters, where smoke from the hearth curls up and seasons them naturally. Sometimes you bury meat in barrels of brine, heavy lids sealing the smell. A quirky trick some villagers whisper about is storing butter or fat inside animal stomachs, stitched tight to keep air out. Strange, yes, but survival makes innovators of everyone. The children beg for meat constantly. You give them thin slices, just enough to chew. They grin, grease smearing their lips, the joy of brightening their pale faces. You save the bigger cuts for stews, chopping them into small pieces to stretch across several meals. Sometimes the meat is so salty you have to boil it twice, tossing the first water out to make it edible. You joke that it's a cleansing ritual and the kids roll their eyes, but you know the truth. Without that step, the salt alone could sicken you. There's a darker side to all this, of course. The church calendar dictates when you can eat meat and when you can't. On fasting days, which come often, meat is forbidden. Fish becomes the substitute, though inland it's hard to find. So sometimes you sneak a little bacon, hoping no one sees. You mutter a half-hearted prayer, asking forgiveness. Surely God understands, it's survival. And yet, despite the rules, despite the danger, despite the rationing, meat is a kind of joy. You celebrate it, you gossip about it. Neighbors trade a chunk of pork for a sack of beans or a few sausages for firewood. It's currency as much as food. And in a world where coin is scarce, a smoked ham hanging from your ceiling is as valuable as silver. As you chew the salty strip, you look around at the snow piling against the shed walls. You smile grimly. This meat is your shield, your answer to winter's hunger. It won't last forever, nothing does. But tonight, you'll gnaw on bacon, and tomorrow, perhaps stew. And for a few moments at least, you'll forget the cold gnawing at your bones. The cold seeps into your bones no matter how close you huddle to the hearth, but there's one thing in the cottage that gives you both comfort and calories: the wheel of cheese sitting proudly on a wooden shelf. It's hard, cracked at the edges, and smells faintly like a pair of boots left too long in a damp corner, but to you, it's gold. In summer, when the cows grazed on green fields and the goats nibbled on every shrub in sight, milk was plentiful. But fresh milk spoils than you can blink, so the solution was simple and ingenious: turn it into cheese. And now, in the bleak depths of winter, that decision pays off. You cut into the wheel with a small knife, and it resists you like stone. The slice comes away with a satisfying crumble, the texture chalky at first, then rich once it warms on your tongue. The is sharp, nutty, a little sour, nothing like the creamy stuff you imagine nobles spreading on white bread, but hearty enough to keep you going. The kids wrinkle their noses at the smell, but when their teeth sink into it, they chew without complaint. Hunger has a way of making even the smelliest cheese taste divine. Cheese is not just food, it's insurance. A well-aged wheel can last months, even a year if stored carefully. You keep it in the coolest corner of the cottage, away from the smoke but safe from mice. Sometimes you wax the rind with tallow, sometimes you rub it with salt. Everyone has their trick. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants enjoyed cheese daily or only on special occasions. Some records suggest dairy was plentiful for them, while others argue most of it went straight to the Lord as rent. Whatever the truth, you know the cheese you keep hidden is survival pressed into a round. There's a quirky tidbit you've heard from wandering peddlers. In some monasteries, monks made cheeses so enormous they could barely roll them down the cellar stairs. They aged them for years, slicing off chunks like treasure. You laugh, imagining monks playing cheese bowling for fun. For you, a wheel the size of your fist is already precious. A wheel the size of a man, that's fantasy. Cheese also connects you to the animals outside. You remember milking the cow last summer, her warm flank pressed against you, the stream of milk frothing into the bucket. You remember straining it through cloth, heating it gently, stirring in rennet, sometimes made from a calf's stomach lining, sometimes from herbs if you're lucky. The curds formed, solid and squeaky, and you pressed them into molds, sweating in the summer heat, not knowing then how much you'd thank yourself now. Cheese is summer sunshine, trapped for winter mouths. You nibble a piece slowly, a joke slips out, you call it medieval hard candy. The kids groan, but they laugh anyway. You grin because lightens the heavy taste and the heavy truth. The cheese must be rationed. Too much now means nothing later. So you cut small slivers, tuck the rest back onto the shelf, and cover it with cloth. Out of sight, out of mind. You've also learned that cheese makes friends. A neighbor once traded you half a sack of beans for a wedge of your goat cheese. Another time, you gave a slice to the priest in exchange for his blessing on your fields. In a world without banks, cheese is currency, melted gold you can actually chew. Tonight, you stir some into a pot of hot porridge, watching it melt into gooey strings. The children's eyes widen, their spoons clattering with excitement. For a moment, the cottage feels like a feast hall, laughter bouncing off the rafters, the smell of warm dairy masking the chill. You know it won't last, but that's what makes it sweeter. So you sit back, a crust of bread in one hand, a wedge of cheese in the other. Outside, the snow buries the fields in silence. Inside, your mouth is full, your heart a little lighter, and your survival just a bit more certain. In winter, cheese is more than food. It's hope wrapped in rind, sharp on the tongue, steady in the belly. The frost on the window pane looks like delicate feathers, but you're not admiring the beauty, you're calculating what's left in your root cellar. Beneath the cottage, a low, damp chamber dug into the earth, lies your secret pantry of vegetables. You light a stub of tallow candle, crouch low, and lift the wooden trapdoor. A wave of cool, earthy air hits you, tinged with the faint of onions and the sweet musk of cabbages. This place, dark and quiet, is your true winter lifeline. Your hands brush against burlap sacks filled with turnips, carrots, and beets. Some are shriveled, some sprouting pale shoots like ghostly fingers, but they're edible. You pull out a cabbage, its outer leaves yellowed and rubbery, the inner heart still crisp if you peel carefully. Not glamorous, not pretty, but dependable. You wipe dirt from your palms and smile. This cabbage might keep your children full for 2 more days. Vegetables don't keep themselves. You remember back in autumn, crouching in the field, twisting cabbages from the ground, pulling onions by their long green stalks. You hung them in braids, stacked them in cool sand, layered them carefully so they wouldn't rot each other out. One careless bruise, one damp patch, and a whole sack might turn slimy. You've seen it happen, neighbors weeping as weeks of food dissolved into mush. So you check the cellar daily, your eyes sharper than a merchant counting coins. Historians still argue whether peasants truly had enough vegetables to get them through the cold, or whether famine winters forced them to rely almost entirely on grain. Some say the cellars were miracles of careful planning. Others think the reality was more grim, rotting stores, endless hunger. You, crouched here with your flickering candle, know both are true. Some years the vegetables stretch like magic. Other years they vanish too soon. There's a quirky tidbit about onions. People believed they could absorb illness. Some villagers hang them in windows to ward off plague. You snort at the thought. You're not sure if an onion can cure death, but you do know it can turn a pot of watery gruel into something worth chewing. You slice one thin, toss it into boiling water, and the whole cottage smells alive again. That smell alone makes bellies rumble in anticipation. The turnips are another story. Pale, bitter, they're no ones. You joke that eating them builds character. The kids groan, rolling their eyes, but they gnaw on boiled slices anyway. Hunger makes even turnips edible. Sometimes you mash them with a little lard, pretending it's butter. Sometimes you roast them in the embers until the skins blacken and peel back, leaving sweet flesh inside. Tricks like that make the monotony tolerable. Carrots, when you find them, are small and crooked, not the bright orange giants you imagine in modern markets. Medieval carrots were often purple or white, earthy and tough. Still, they store well, and when grated into pottage, they bring to the pot. Beets too add richness, staining everything red, which makes the children giggle nervously. It looks like blood stew, they whisper. You grin and tell them not to worry, at least it's not rat stew. They laugh, relieved, and keep eating. Potatoes, you remind yourself, don't exist yet in your part of the world. That miracle tuber won't arrive from the Americas for centuries. Instead, you rely on these humble roots. They may not fill you with joy, but they fill you with life. That's enough. You carry the cabbage upstairs, candle guttering. Back in the hearth pot, you strip away the wilted leaves, chop the crisp core, and drop it into the simmering porridge. Steam rises, sweet and vegetal. The smell alone feels like hope. Your spouse sighs with relief. Your children clap their hands. The cottage warms not just from the fire, but from the reminder that food still waits below, buried in the earth like treasure. You sit together, slurping hot cabbage stew, bread crusts dunked in broth. Outside, the snow deepens, muffling the world in silence. Inside, the humble roots whisper survival. No feasts, no luxuries, just cabbages, turnips, onions, and the stubborn will to last until spring. The snow crunches beneath your boots as you wander past the bare fields, each step a reminder that nothing grows now. The earth is hard as iron, the hedgerows brittle with ice. Still, your eyes scan the ground, the branches, even the bark of trees, because you know the secret every peasant learns early. Food doesn't always come from the larder. Sometimes it comes from the wild, even in the heart of winter. You spot the withered husks of hazelnut shells under a tree, remnants of autumn's harvest. If you're lucky, a few nuts still hide beneath the snow, tucked away by squirrels who forgot them. You dig with chilled fingers, your breath puffing in little clouds, and there it is, a small treasure, a nut hard as stone but edible. Crack it open, chew slowly, and you taste a faint, sweet oil, a memory of warmer months. Berries are harder to find now, though sometimes dried blackberries cling stubbornly to brambles. Their shriveled skins taste sharp, almost medicinal, but they're better than nothing. You think back to summer when berries stained your hands purple, when children laughed with mouths full of juice. Now, in the white silence, a single frozen berry feels like a miracle. Herbs too can be scavenged. A patch of nettles hiding beneath snowdrifts, a sprig of wild thyme dried on its stem. You pick what you can, tuck it into your pouch, knowing it will your stews later. A tiny burst of green among endless gray. Some villagers even steep bark in hot water, calling it tree tea. Birch bark has a sweet hint, willow bark a bitter tang. You sip grimace, but at least it warms you. Historians still argue whether peasants relied heavily on these forest teas or whether they were desperate measures in famine years. You don't care. You know the comfort of wrapping your hands around a steaming cup when your belly groans empty. There's a quirky tidbit about pine needles. Some folk believe they ward off scurvy, though you wouldn't know the word for it. You just know a hot pine needle brew clears your head and tastes a little like drinking a forest. You grin, telling the children it's Christmas tree soup, and they giggle, their breath fogging in the cold. Jokes are seasoning when runs thin. Mushrooms are dangerous in winter, though. You've heard tales of families gathering the wrong kind and never waking again. Some say witches mark the poisonous ones with curses, but you're not inclined to test it. Better to go without than risk death by stew. Still, dried mushrooms stored from autumn can be crumbled into broth, turning it earthy, rich, almost meaty. You bless yourself when you find a handful tucked in a pouch you forgotten. Even animal tracks become a kind of grocery list. You see rabbit prints the snow. Maybe tomorrow you'll set a snare, but today, just knowing they're out there makes your stomach tighten with hope. For now, you settle for foraged odds and ends, nuts, bark tea, a sprig of dried herbs. Not much, but they stretch the meals, keep variety alive, trick the mind into believing the diet isn't all porridge and cabbage. Back home, you scatter crushed nuts into the children's bowls. Their eyes brighten at the oily crunch. You stir in a few dried berries, the bleeding into the broth like little jewels. The cottage smells faintly of thyme, and for a moment, you could almost imagine you're feasting. You even joke that this stew is peasant trail mix, earning groans and laughter in equal measure. The truth is, foraging in snow is survival disguised as scavenger hunt. You may come home with little, but that little keeps the spirit alive. It reminds you that the world still offers something, even when the fields are barren. You sip your bark tea, chew your hard-won nuts, and lean back by the fire. The winter may be cruel, but the forest still whispers, "Here, take this. It's not much, but it will keep you alive another day." The morning is bleak, frost curling like lace over the edges of your window. You pull your cloak tighter and shuffle toward the table where a wooden jug waits. It isn't wine, heaven knows that's too rich for your purse, and it isn't water either, because you've learned the hard way that drinking from the stream can give you more than thirst relief. It can give you days of agony. No, what you pour into your cup is ale, thin and weak, but safer than water and warm enough to chase away the cold edge of dawn. You lift the cup to your lips. The ale is cloudy, the of straw, and its taste is sour-sweet, a little rough on the tongue. But it fills your belly and calms your nerves. Even your children drink it, not the strong ale of taverns, but the small beer barely alcoholic, just enough fermentation to kill off dangerous germs. Historians still argue whether peasants guzzled gallons daily or if water played a larger role, but the truth in your world is clear. Ale is life. Without it, disease waits in every bucket of stream water. The brewing itself is a communal affair. Grain that might have gone into bread is malted, soaked, sprouted, dried, then boiled with water, with bitter herbs, sometimes hops if you're lucky enough to have them. The mixture ferments in barrels, the scent sharp and yeasty. Every cottage has its recipe, every brewer their quirks. Your neighbor swears by tossing in nettles. Your aunt adds honey when she can. The result is always the same. A drink safer than water, richer than plain broth, and steadying enough to face another cold day. You joke to your children that the ale is liquid bread, and in truth, it's not far off. It's filling, nourishing with calories that matter in lean months. Sometimes, after a long day, you let yourself indulge in a stronger brew, one that warms your chest and makes you laugh more easily. But most days, it's the weak ale, practical and plain, that keeps you standing. There's a quirky tidbit you've heard from a passing peddler. In some towns, alewives marked their doors with a broomstick hung sideways, a sign that fresh beer was ready. You chuckle at the thought of a medieval drive-through, though here, it's just a neighbor's doorway and a cup. Drinking ale isn't just survival, it's social. You gather at the tavern, huddled around smoky fires, mugs clinking as stories fly. Laughter bursts through cracked lips, and for a moment hunger is forgotten. A neighbor brags about catching a fat rabbit, another complains about his aching back. You join in, the ale smoothing your words, binding you to the rhythm of village life. In a world where toil never ends, ale is the one constant comfort, the one steady companion. Even the church can't ignore it. Monks brew ale in monasteries, their recipes guarded like treasure. They drink too, though more solemnly, more piously, or so they say. You imagine them in their cold halls, mugs in hand, chanting prayers between swigs. You smirk, muttering under your breath that God must prefer barley to water. The children, meanwhile, sip their small beer without fuss. It's weak, barely fermented, more a malty tea than anything else. You watch them slurp it down with their bread and porridge, and you feel relief. They are drinking safely, without fear of fever. In this way, ale is more than tradition. It's medicine disguised as daily drink. Back home, you refill your cup, the warmth spreading through your chest. Outside, the snow piles higher against the cottage walls. Inside, you feel just a little braver, a little fuller. You lean back, smile at your family, and raise your mug with a mock toast to weak beer strong enough to keep us alive. They laugh, clink wooden cups, and for a moment, the cold outside doesn't matter. Your breath hangs in the air like smoke as you step beyond the village edge, a crude snare dangling from your hand. The snow crunches beneath your boots, every sound sharp in the winter silence. Hunger gnaws at you worse than the frost, and your eyes scan the white fields for movement. If bread is the foundation, and porridge the routine, then hunting, when it succeeds, is the rare miracle that makes your belly sing. You kneel by a rabbit track, small prints stitched into the snow. With stiff fingers, you set the looped cord across the trail, hopping some unlucky hare blunders into it before nightfall. You whisper a half prayer, half joke, "Saints, send me dinner." Hunting is tricky business. Technically, the Lord owns the forests, the game, even the fish in the streams. You, the peasant, are allowed only scraps, hares, birds, anything too small to tempt his appetite. Deer, boar, even swans, those are forbidden. But hunger doesn't care about laws. Historians still argue whether peasants regularly poached or if such stories are romantic exaggerations. You know the truth from experience. Sometimes the choice is between breaking the law or starving. You remember one night slipping into the forest with a borrowed bow. The moonlight silvered the trees, your heart pounding louder than your footsteps. A deer appeared, breath steaming in the cold. You loosed the arrow, your hands trembling. The shot was clumsy, but it struck true. You and your neighbors butchered it in secret, smoking the meat in a hidden pit, it in whispers. The next week, the Lord's men came sniffing, demanding to know if anyone had seen poachers. Everyone shook their heads, eyes wide with innocence, bellies still full of venison stew. You laugh at the memory, though your stomach clenches at the risk you took. Today you settle for rabbits. If fortune smiles, you'll catch one by dusk. Sometimes you stretch nets across hedgerows to snare birds, fat wood pigeons or thrushes. A child with a slingshot might bring down a sparrow. Not much, but stewed with onions, it makes broth rich enough to feel like luxury. A quirky tidbit floats through your mind. Some peasants roasted hedgehogs, baking them in clay until the spines peeled off. You shudder, half amused, half tempted, because hunger makes strange things appetizing. Back in the village, you share stories of hunts like fishermen bragging about catches. One man claims he snared 3 rabbits in a single night. Another swears he saw a fox sneak into the henhouse. You all laugh, mugs of ale in hand, knowing that most hunts end in empty hands and cold feet. But sometimes, just sometimes, you come home with meat enough to silence hunger for a day. As the sun sets, you check your snares. One lies empty, another snapped, and your heart sinks. Then in the last snare you find it, a rabbit stiff and still, its fur dusted with snow. Relief floods you. You murmur thanks to the forest, to chance, maybe even to luck itself. You tuck the rabbit into your pouch and hurry home, your breath quickening not from exertion, but from the joy of knowing tonight there will be meat in the pot. At the hearth you skin the rabbit, your hands steady despite the hunger. The meat is lean, almost stringy, but it's enough. You chop it into the stew pot, the broth hissing as the flesh sizzles. The smell fills the cottage, rich, gamey. The children crowd close, eyes wide, mouths watering. You tease them, saying it smells like noble feasts, though you both know nobles eat far richer fare. Still, for you, this is a banquet. You sit together, spoons scraping the pot, every mouthful. You even crack a joke, careful chewing, or you'll bite a bullet. The children giggle, not knowing what a bullet is, but laughing anyway. Keeps the shadows at bay, even on nights when meat is rare. When the bowls are empty and your stomach is warm, you lean back with a sigh. Hunting is risky, sometimes fruitless, often dangerous. But tonight, it has given you more than food. It has given you proof that, even in the dead of winter, you can still snatch life from the teeth of hunger. The snow lies heavy on the thatched roofs, and the village bell tolls, reminding you of more than just the passing hours. It reminds you of fasting days, the endless cycle of the church calendar that dictates not only when you pray, but what you put into your mouth. You sigh because today is one of those days, no meat allowed. And while the thought of going without bacon makes your stomach grumble in protest, there's another option waiting for you, fish. You grab your basket and head toward the frozen stream, boots crunching against the icy ground. The water is dark, sluggish, but still moving beneath the thin crust of ice. You break a hole with a stick. the sound echoing sharp against the silence, and peer into the rippling water. If you're lucky, you'll pull out a few small perch or eels, slimy, wriggling, and not nearly enough to call a feast, but better than another bowl of plain porridge. Historians still argue whether fish truly flowed freely into peasant pots, or if most of it was reserved for monasteries and markets. What you know is that when you catch one, you guard it like treasure. Fish and fasting are tied together in ways you can't escape. The church says nearly half the days of the year are fast days, meaning no meat, no dairy, no eggs. That's a cruel joke in winter, when survival already feels like a tightrope walk. But fish is allowed. So peasants like you depend on rivers, ponds, and sometimes salted herring hauled in from distant coasts. The irony stings. Here, far from the sea, a barrel of herring costs more than you can dream of paying. But every now and then, a trader passes through, and you scrape together coins for a few salty, pungent fish that perfume the cottage for days. You grin, remembering the quirky story your grandmother told. Villagers once believed eels could crawl out of mud by magic, spawning without parents. Some even thought fish dropped from the sky during storms. You chuckle, imagining God tossing down dinner with the rain. Truth or not, when an eel thrashes in your basket, it feels like a gift from heaven. Back at the hearth, you clean the catch. The children wrinkle their noses at the smell, but their eyes follow your every move. You gut the fish, toss it into the bubbling pot, and soon the broth shifts from thin to savory, the steam carrying a hint of the river. You break bread into the soup, letting it soak up the oily richness. Suddenly, your dinner feels different, lighter than meat, but with a taste that lingers on the tongue. You sip slowly. The bones are tricky, always threatening to stab your gums, but you've grown skilled at spitting them discreetly. The children joke that it's like a game, find the bone before it finds you. You laugh, shaking your head, because even in hunger, you make a sport of survival. The church bells ring again in the distance, reminding you that tomorrow may also be a fast day. Sometimes it feels cruel, almost comical, that you're told to abstain from meat when you barely have meat to begin with. Still, you cross yourself, muttering a prayer. Maybe fasting isn't about denial, it's about discipline, about reminding yourself that survival isn't just in the body, but in the spirit. At least that's what the priest says. You're not sure if your empty stomach agrees. Still, when the bowls are licked clean and the children curl near the fire, you feel grateful. Fish may not be venison, may not be smoked bacon, but it's something. Something warm, something filling, something different. And in the bleak monotony of winter, difference itself feels like luxury. So you settle back, hands on your stomach, listening to the crackle of the fire. Outside, the river gurgles under its icy lid, promising more meals if luck is kind. Inside, you whisper a joke to yourself, better a fish bone in the throat than no fish at all. You chuckle softly, because in the quiet of winter, even a joke that bad is worth holding onto. The stew pot is nearly empty tonight, just a thin broth swirling with a few limp cabbage leaves. Your belly aches for variety, for something that tastes less like soil and more like excitement. But unless you're a noble feasting in a hall, excitement doesn't often appear in a peasant's bowl. That doesn't mean you've never caught a whiff of it, sometimes quite literally. Spices, those rare little miracles, are the whispers of faraway lands that occasionally trickle down even to your rough wooden table. You remember the first time you tasted pepper, just a pinch, dusted onto a lord's leftovers that made their way down through servants, then into the village. The shock of it hit your tongue like tiny sparks, sharp and warm, unlike anything your own garden could produce. You coughed, laughed, then for more. Pepper, cinnamon, saffron, These are words that feel like fairy tales. Historians still argue whether common folk had any real access to such luxuries or whether it was reserved solely for the wealthy. You know the truth from experience. Once in a while, if luck, trade, or charity intervenes, you catch a taste. Most days your spice rack is humble. Garlic, onions, mustard seeds, maybe horseradish roots grated until your nose runs. Strong, pungent that grows stubbornly in the cold soil. But when someone in the village has a relative who works in a monastery kitchen, or a merchant passes through with a pouch of dried saffron threads, you dream of what food could be. One neighbor swears he once had stew sprinkled with ginger. He tells the story like a bard spinning tales of dragons. You half believe him, half think he's just showing off. There's a quirky tidbit whispered among villagers that spices were so valuable, debts were paid in peppercorns, each one worth its weight in silver. You laugh, imagining yourself tossing a handful of pepper at the tax collector instead of coins. Here, you'd say, don't sneeze away my fortune. The children giggle when you share this joke, pretending to count invisible peppercorns like treasure. But in reality, spices are rare, fleeting, and precious. Once, the priest at the church communion wine with a touch of cloves, the aroma alone transporting you far from your cottage, as if you'd stepped into a warmer, more generous world. For a moment, you almost believed holiness could be tasted. Still, you make do with what you have. You grind mustard seeds into a sharp paste, stir horseradish into porridge, rub garlic across bread crusts to trick the tongue into believing it's richer than it is. You save the onion skins for broth, knowing they add more than their weight suggests. You've even chewed juniper berries for their bitterness, pretending it's exotic. It's not, but the act of pretending is half the battle. When spices do appear, they become legend. Villagers gather to sniff the pot, to marvel at how a stew of beans and barley suddenly feels like it belongs in a lord's hall. You tell the children to every bite, because they may not taste such wonders again for years. Their eyes widen, their cheeks flush with excitement, and in that moment, the cottage feels less poor. Tonight, though, there are no peppercorns, no saffron threads, no cinnamon sticks. Just garlic and onion, pungent and sharp, sizzling in the bottom of the pot before you ladle in broth. The smell fills the cottage, earthy and strong, tricking your nose into believing the meal is richer than it is. You sit together, dipping bread, slurping broth, joking that garlic keeps away vampires, though the only real monsters you fear are hunger and frost. When the bowls are empty, you lean back and sigh. Spices may be rare, but their memory lingers like ghosts on your tongue. You smile quietly, thinking, survival is about endurance, but joy sometimes arrives in pinches. Just one peppercorn can turn survival into celebration, even if only for a night. The fire in the hearth has burned low, glowing embers casting soft orange light across the room. You glance at the children curled in their blankets, their bellies not quite full, but at least quiet for now. What lingers on your mind, though, is sweetness. Not the kind of sweetness nobles gorge on with candied fruits and imported sugar. No, that's a fantasy. For peasants like you, sweetness comes rarely, and when it does, it feels almost divine. Your hands reach for the small clay pot tucked high on a shelf, away from greedy fingers and curious mice. You open it carefully, and inside gleams something golden, honey, thick, sticky, sunlight trapped in syrup form. You dip a finger in, taste it on your tongue, and sigh. The is wild, floral, sharp in a way that no cabbage stew or barley porridge could ever dream of being. Honey is not just food, it is celebration. Bees are mysterious neighbors in your world. You've seen their hives in hollow trees, buzzing clouds that seem like magic. Villagers whisper that bees carry souls, or that they must be informed when a master dies, lest they abandon the hive in mourning. Quirky stories swirl. If you talk sweetly to bees, they'll reward you. If you anger them, famine follows. You chuckle at the thought, but treat them with respect all the same. A sting hurts, but the reward, honey and wax, is worth it. Sugar, the other form of sweetness, is more legend than reality. You've heard tales of nobles drizzling it over roasted meats, of kings commissioning sugar sculptures shaped like castles. Historians still argue whether peasants ever touched sugar at all, except perhaps a single grain on rare occasions. You know you've never tasted it, and you probably never will. To you, sugar is a word that means not for your kind. Honey, though, that belongs to the fields, the meadows, the buzzing hives hidden in the forest. On feast days, you sometimes stir a spoonful of honey into porridge. The children's faces light up as if you'd given them treasure. Once, on Christmas, you even baked small honey cakes, the smell filling the cottage with joy, the sweetness lifting spirits higher than any sermon. You joked that the bees themselves must have been singing hymns as they made it. The laughter carried longer than the cakes lasted. There are stranger sweets too. Some peasants chew dried apples or pears stored from autumn, their shriveled flesh still carrying a hint of sugar. Others boil down beetroot until it caramelizes, sticky and dark, a poor man's candy. You've chewed on roasted chestnuts, their creamy sweetness lingering on your tongue. They may not be sugar, but they're enough to remind you that life isn't always bitter. One evening, a traveling merchant passed through with candied almonds. You traded a small wedge of cheese and a daze for a handful. The children squealed, their sticky fingers covered in joy, their cheeks smeared with sugar crystals. You laughed until your stomach hurt, not because of the taste, but because of the sight, your family, for once, tasting luxury. Tonight, you let yourself have just a spoonful of honey. You close your eyes, the way it melts slowly, how it clings to your lips. For a brief moment, you forget the cold, the hunger, the endless monotony of rye bread and turnip stew. Sweetness has that power. It reminds you of sunlight in the dead of winter, of summer fields buzzing with bees, of joy hidden in the simplest things. You lick the last drop from your finger and carefully seal the pot again. There isn't much left, and you know you must save it for leaner days, for when despair gnaws harder than hunger. Sweetness is not survival, but it is hope, and hope is just as necessary. As you crawl under your blanket, you chuckle softly to yourself. Better to have honey on your lips than frost in your beard. It's not much of a joke, but it makes you smile, and you drift into dreams with that golden taste still lingering in your mouth. The night is colder than usual, the kind of cold that makes the timbers of the cottage creak like old men's bones. But tonight isn't just another bleak winter evening, it's a feast day. The bells from the church tower rang earlier, their echoes bouncing across snow-laden fields, reminding every villager that even in hunger, even in hardship, there are moments meant to break the monotony. You feel it in your chest. Tonight there will be food and maybe even laughter. The village square comes alive as people shuffle in with what they can spare. One neighbor carries a loaf of bread, another drags in a small cask of ale. Someone managed to save a goose plucked clean, its skin pale in the firelight. You contribute what little you can, a wedge of cheese, hard as stone but still good. The priest blesses the food, his voice booming against the frosty air, and then the feasting begins. You clutch a wooden bowl as steaming stew is ladled out, rich with fat and you haven't tasted in weeks. The meat melts on your tongue, juicy and decadent compared to the stringy rabbit or salted pork you ration at home. Children shriek with joy as pies are cut open, steam billowing into the cold night. The smell alone, warm fat, onions, herbs, feels like heaven poured into your nostrils. Historians still argue whether peasants often enjoyed such community feasts or whether these were rare flashes of abundance. You don't care what the scholars say. Right now, you're living proof that when food gathers in plenty, spirits soar higher than the church steeple. The quirky side of these gatherings always shows. Someone inevitably gets too deep into the ale and starts singing bawdy songs, their voice cracking like firewood. Children chase each other, clutching scraps of pastry like prizes. You laugh, your belly shaking, and for the first time in weeks, the tight knot of hunger loosens. You even sneak a joke to your neighbor: if we eat like this often, the Lord will start charging tax on our bellies. He cackles, nearly choking on his meat pie. The feast isn't just about food, it's about relief. For one night, you're not rationing, not scraping pots, not counting loaves. You're human again, warmed from the inside out. And when the dancing starts, boots stomping, skirts swirling, you clap along, the rhythm pushing back the shadows of winter. But even in the midst of joy, there's awareness. This won't last. Tomorrow you'll return to porridge, to bread crusts, to cabbage stew. Still, the memory of tonight will carry you. You'll remember the taste of fatty goose melting in your mouth, the smell of fresh pies, the laughter that filled the square like music. These are the moments that stitch your soul back together when hunger frays it thin. Later, back in the cottage, your belly full, you tuck the children in with smiles still on their faces. Their cheeks glow from warmth and laughter, not just from the fire. You sit by the dying embers, thinking how odd it is that survival can feel so grim one night and so glorious the next. The church bells have gone silent, the square empty again, but inside you lingers a soft glow, the echo of community and plenty. You whisper to yourself, half amused, half reverent, a feast in winter is worth 10 in summer. Then you chuckle because it's true. In the dead of winter, joy tastes richer, and for one night, you've been reminded what it means not just to live, but to live well. The night after the feast feels quieter, emptier, as if the very walls remember the warmth that has already passed. Your belly growls again, not with hunger alone, but with the echo of meat pies and fat goose you know won't return soon. You trudge to the larder and stare at what's left. A half sack of grain, a few shriveled roots, a sliver of cheese. It's not enough. Winter stretches long, and you know the truth every peasant whispers in the dark. Famine is never more than a bad harvest away. You've seen it before. The rains ruined the barley one year and the wheat where it stood. What should have been a season of golden fields became a season of mud. When the stores ran out, people grew desperate. Bread was stretched thinner and thinner until it was hardly bread at all. You remember your neighbor grinding acorns into meal, the bitter tannins leaching into every bite. Some even stripped bark from trees, peeling the soft inner layer, drying it, and mixing it into dough. The loaves came out gray and sour, barely chewable, but they filled the belly just enough to trick it into silence. Historians still argue whether bark bread was common or just a desperate last resort. But to you, the memory of its taste is proof enough. It happened, and it was as grim as it sounds. You stir a pot of thin gruel, the steam rising weak and watery. There's hardly enough to go around, so you break it into smaller bowls, the children's eyes wide with disappointment. You smile anyway, pretending it's a delicacy, joking, "Tonight we dine like kings on invisible stew." The little ones laugh through their groans, but you know the truth. These are famine rations, and they will only get leaner. Quirky substitutions appear in desperate times. Chestnuts, ground into flour, can bulk up bread. Weeds like goosefoot or sorrel get boiled into soups. Even nettles stinging in your hands become edible once cooked. You've chewed on roasted acorns, their bitterness sticking to your tongue, pretending they were nuts fit for feasts. You've sipped broth made from boiled bones long after the marrow was gone. Each substitution is both clever and tragic, a testament to ingenuity and to desperation. The elders always suffer first. They push their bowls toward the children, insisting they aren't hungry, though their hollow cheeks say otherwise. The children, in turn, cry at night, clutching their bellies. You try to sing them to sleep, your voice soft and cracked, the lullabies more distraction than comfort. The cottage air grows heavy, not just with hunger but with fear. You recall stories of the great famine whispered by, when rains fell for years and whole villages starved. People spoke of eating cats, dogs, even worse things that make your skin crawl. You shake your head, muttering a prayer that your own village never sinks so low. Hunger already gnaws at your ribs. You don't want to imagine worse. Still, famine teaches resilience. You trade what little you have, bartering a handful of beans for a scoop of grain, a day's for a crust of bread. You chew slowly, stretch portions, trick your stomach with hot water. Sometimes, when it's unbearable, you go to bed early, telling yourself sleep tastes better than hunger. Tonight, after the thin stew is gone, you sit by the embers, your belly half empty. You run your tongue over your teeth, the bitterness of acorn bread still lingering from last year. You laugh softly, bitterly, "I'll never look at trees the same way again." The joke is feeble, but the children giggle, and for a moment the weight lifts. You lie down on your straw bed, your body restless, your mind haunted by the thin line between surviving winter and succumbing to it. Hunger may strip away joy, but it also sharpens your will. Tomorrow you'll rise, scrape together what you can, and keep going. Because famine, cruel as it is, has only one lesson: endure or be swallowed by the cold. The fire pops in the hearth, a weak little flame doing its best against the freezing dark. You glance around your cottage, and your eyes linger not on the food, because there's hardly any, but on the faces of your family. The children huddle together under a blanket, their thin arms wrapped around each other, their cheeks hollow from too many weeks of thin stew. In the corner, your mother sits silently, her breath wheezy, her hands trembling as she tries to mend a cloak by candlelight. Tonight, your food isn't the only worry. Tonight, it's about who gets to eat and who doesn't. In a house like yours, children and elders live on the edge. The strong can swing axes, haul firewood, trudge to the forest to forage, but the youngest they rely on scraps and on your mercy. You ladle out the stew, careful to pour a little more into the children's bowls. They eat with wide eyes, slurping greedily, and you smile, pretending not to notice your mother only poking at hers. You nudge her gently, urging her to eat, but she shakes her head, whispering that she's not hungry. You know better. Hunger hides behind pride, especially in the old. Historians still argue whether medieval families rationed food by age or by, did the workers get more or did the children? Some records hint that peasants their strongest, feeding those who could toil, while others suggest the youngest was spared from sacrifice. In truth, you know it's never so neat. Each family makes painful choices. Tonight, you've chosen the children. Tomorrow, you might choose differently. The little ones often get watered-down versions of meals. Milk if you still have it, broth skimmed of meat, bread softened in ale so their small teeth won't break. You joke with them that they're drinking baby beer, and they giggle through their sips. It's a way of making thin survival food feel like something special. You tell them stories while they eat, weaving tales of heroic knights who slay dragons and then share soup with starving villagers. They cheer at the ending, bowls empty, but hearts a little fuller. For the elders, the meals are harder. Your mother's hands shake when she tries to tear tough bread, so you soften it in broth, slipping it to her quietly. You remember how she once did the same for you when you were small, dunking crusts into milk. Now the roles have reversed, and the weight of that truth presses heavy on your chest. Sometimes she refuses altogether, whispering prayers, saying she's lived long enough. You snap at her, half in anger, half in fear, reminding her that her wisdom is as necessary as food itself. She smiles, weary but proud, and takes a bite just to calm you. There's a quirky tidbit told in the village that some elders would hide food under their bedding, pretending they'd eaten so the children wouldn't worry. You laugh at the thought, then sigh, realizing it isn't just a story. Last winter, you found a crust tucked beneath your mother's straw mat, rock hard, uneaten. She'd lied, as parents always do, to keep you strong. The memory makes your eyes sting even now. You stir the pot again, scraping the bottom for the last bits. You joke loudly, "Look, a surprise feast." The children laugh, though you all know there's barely a spoonful left. Once again is the seasoning that keeps despair from choking you. When the bowls are cleaned and the children drowsy with what little warmth the food gave, you tuck them in near the fire. Your mother hums a low lullaby, her voice cracked but soothing. You lean back, watching them all, feeling both relief and dread. Relief that tonight they are alive. Dread that tomorrow will ask the same impossible question: who gets to eat first and who must wait? As you crawl into your straw bed, you whisper a quiet promise to yourself that you'll find more tomorrow, that you'll trap another rabbit, that you'll dig deeper into the cellar, that you'll barter if you must. Because while winter tests your body, it tests your heart even more. Children and elders cannot survive on scraps alone, and so you carry the burden of choosing, rationing, and praying. You close your eyes, the weight heavy as stone, and hope morning brings mercy. The rooster doesn't crow in winter mornings the way it does in spring. The silence is broken only by the moan of the wind and the creak of frozen timbers. You rise anyway, joints stiff, belly hollow, and thoughts heavy with one thing: survival is not a solitary sport. In these months, your own hands alone won't keep the stew pot full. You need your neighbors and they need you. That's how winter is endured, not by stockpiles alone, but by trading, borrowing, and bartering your way through the cold. You pull on your rough boots and step into the snowy lane. Smoke rises lazily from chimneys, and you know every hearth hides the same question you woke with: do we have enough? Your neighbor waves weakly, his face pale. He's run out of onions, and without their bite, his stews taste like boiled water. You, on the other hand, have a small sack left in the cellar. So you walk over, swap half a dozen onions for a small pouch of beans he's kept hidden. The deal is fair enough, and you both smile, teeth flashing like rare treasures. This is the rhythm of winter. What you have becomes currency, and generosity is balanced with survival. Historians still argue whether peasants lived in constant conflict or steady cooperation. Some records suggest endless quarrels over firewood, over pigs wandering into fields. Others tell of tight-knit communities that pooled resources. You've lived the truth, it's both. Hunger sharpens tempers, but it also forces hands to clasp. Alone, you starve. Together, you scrape by. This afternoon, a widow down the lane offers to mend your cloak in exchange for a slice of your hard cheese. Her fingers are quick with needle and thread, and she smiles faintly as she works. You joke, "At this rate, I'll be naked but warm." She chuckles, handing back your patched cloak, and pockets the cheese as though it were a gold coin. Both of you walk away satisfied. Sometimes the exchanges are stranger. A boy trades you a bundle of firewood for a turnip. A shepherd offers wool in return for a cup of honey. You once gave a neighbor half a loaf of rye in exchange for him helping dig your roof clear of snow. These trades aren't just about food, they're about trust. Your survival is stitched together from 1,000 little bargains. There's a quirky story in the village of a man who traded so cleverly he ended the winter with more than he started. He bartered onions for beans, beans for bacon, bacon for bread, bread for ale, and so on until his cellar was fuller than anyone's. You laugh when you hear it, but secretly you admire him. In famine, cleverness is as important as muscle. You return home with a bundle of beans, a patched cloak, and the faint warmth of knowing your neighbors still stand beside you. You stir the beans into the pot, the stew thickening as it bubbles. The children clap when they see the pot fuller than yesterday. You smile, lifting your spoon like a by the power of trade. Tonight we eat like merchants. They giggle, their cheeks flushed with the firelight. As the night deepens, you think of how fragile these bonds are. Tomorrow, hunger might sour them. A neighbor might close his door, guard his cellar, curse your begging. But tonight, at least, trade has worked its magic. Your belly will be fuller, your cloak warmer, your heart a little lighter. You crawl into bed with the thought lingering. Winter is not beaten by hoarding, but by just enough, trading just enough, trusting just enough. The snow may be endless, the cold merciless, but as long as hands exchange onions for beans, cheese for stitches, and hope for hope, you and your neighbors will stagger through to spring. The wind rattles the shutters again tonight, as if the cold itself is knocking, asking to be let in. You huddle closer to the hearth, feeding it the last scraps of wood, watching the sparks jump like tiny fireflies. Food fills the belly, yes, but warmth is its own kind of nourishment. Without it, no amount of bread or porridge will keep life in your bones. The stew on the fire is thin, little more than cabbage water, but you sip it anyway, hands around the steaming bowl. Heat seeps into your fingers, then into your chest. It doesn't taste like much, but it feels like survival. That's the trick you've learned. Hot food tricks your stomach into thinking it's fuller than it is. Boiled water with a pinch of salt can feel like a meal if it's steaming enough. Communal ovens in the village are another lifeline. You and your neighbors huddle together in their glow while your loaves bake, trading gossip and laughter along with warmth. Sometimes you linger long after the bread is done, just to keep your toes from freezing. You joke with that you'd sleep in the oven if it were big enough. He snorts, pointing out that you'd come out baked harder than your bread. The children giggle, and for a moment, hunger loosens its grip. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants had proper heating systems or just smoky hearths that left lungs black. You know the answer from your own coughing. Your hearth is both blessing and curse. The smoke stings your eyes, clings to your clothes, but without it, you'd be a frozen corpse. There are other tricks for warmth that double as survival. You press close together at night, bodies heat under one coarse blanket. You bury hot stones in the straw bedding, letting them radiate through the night. You sip broth just before sleep, its heat lingering long after the fades. Sometimes you even huddle with the animals in the byre, their breath fogging the air, their bodies like living furnaces. The cow lowing softly is not just a beast, it's part of your winter insulation. And then there are the rituals. You've seen neighbors toss herbs into the fire, muttering charms to chase away cold spirits. Some swear by drinking mulled ale spiced with cloves, though that's rare luxury. Others simply dance, stamping feet in circles until laughter replaces shivering. You smile at the memory of one night when the whole village gathered, stomping and clapping around the bonfire, turning hunger into rhythm, cold into song. For a few hours, you almost forgot winter existed. A quirky tidbit you heard once. Some folk believed onions kept in pockets warmed the body from within. You tried it once, stuffing a bulb in your coat, and spent the day smelling like stew. The children teased you, calling you Father Onion. You laughed along, because laughter warms better than any onion could. Tonight, as the stew pot empties, you lean back, cheeks flushed from heat, belly humming from hot liquid. Outside, the snow piles high against the door, but inside, the hearth flickers bravely, shadows dancing on the walls. You look around at your family, their faces glowing in the firelight, and realize that warmth isn't just heat. It's company, it's laughter, it's the rhythm of spoons clinking against bowls in unison. You whisper a half-serious toast into the smoky air, to hot soup, to warm stones, to fires that refuse to die. The children raise their cups of weak ale in mock ceremony, grinning, and for one fragile moment, you believe the warmth might last until morning. The night stretches long and still, and as the wind howls outside the walls of your cottage, you catch yourself glancing at the rafters, at the little charms and dried herbs hanging there. Food fills your stomach, warmth fills your bones, but sometimes survival feels like it needs something more, something unseen, something whispered. That's where the folklore of food creeps in, the old beliefs and kitchen rituals that make every bite feel blessed, or at least less cursed. You remember how your grandmother would mutter a rhyme before breaking bread. In God's name, may this loaf grow, not shrink. She crossed the top of the dough with a knife before baking, claiming it let evil spirits escape so they couldn't sour the loaf. You chuckled then, but tonight, as you carve a hard crust, you find yourself tracing the same little cross, just in case. Historians still argue whether such charms were superstition or simply habit woven into faith. For you, the line is blurry. Why not hedge your bets when survival hangs by a thread? Some villagers swear by hanging garlic in the rafters, not only to season stew, but to ward off sickness. You glance up at the braid of bulbs dangling like pale lanterns, their papery skins rattling when the wind sneaks in. They make the cottage smell sharp, pungent, alive. Others keep sprigs of rosemary or thyme by the hearth, believing they keep food fresh longer or chase away demons of hunger. You roll your eyes at the stories, but still, there's rosemary tucked in the corner of your cupboard. Better silly than sorry. Then there are the stranger tales. One woman in the next village swore that if you stirred porridge only clockwise, it would last longer. Another insisted that spilling salt was an omen of famine, unless you tossed a pinch over your shoulder to blind the devil. A quirky tidbit floats in your memory. Some peasants believed bread loaves screamed if cut too soon after baking. You laugh at the thought, imagining yourself shushing a loaf in the dark. Hunger does strange things to the imagination. The children love these stories most of all. As they sip their weak ale, you spin tales of enchanted cows whose milk never runs dry, of chickens that lay golden eggs, of fields that sprout loaves instead of grain. Their eyes widen, their laughter bubbles, and though their bellies are small, their hope grows large. You know stories won't fill stomachs, but they keep spirits alive, and that's a kind of nourishment too. Even the church layers its own rituals onto food. Before every feast, the priest blesses the table, sprinkling holy water on the bread and meat. You smirk, remembering how the last time one boy whispered that the water made the bread soggy. Still, when you take the blessed bite, it feels different, safer, somehow more potent. Is it faith or hunger convincing you don't care, the effect is real enough? At times, you whisper your own quiet charms. You thank the fire for boiling the stew without spilling. You thank the cow for milk, the bees for honey, the grain for swelling in the field. You may laugh at yourself, but in the silence of winter, gratitude sounds like insurance. You even teach the children little rhymes, beans for strength, bread for breath, soup to keep away cold death. They chant it playfully, clapping their hands, unaware of how much you mean it. Tonight, as you crumble bread into broth, you pause, you bow your head, trace a little sign in the air, and murmur, "May this food be enough." The children mimic you, their voices soft, and for a moment the cottage feels less empty. The stew may be thin, but with charms and prayers and stories, it tastes richer. You lean back after the meal, chuckling softly. If food is half stomach and half story, at least we're never starving. The children giggle, the fire crackles, and outside the wind sighs. You've learned that folklore doesn't change the taste of turnips or the toughness of rye bread, but it does change how you swallow them. And in a winter this long, that might make all the difference. The wind dies down tonight, and in the strange stillness you hear only the soft crackle of the hearth. Your belly is filled with turnip stew and a crust of rye, and though it isn't much, it's enough to keep you alive for another day. Yet as you lean back against the rough wall of your cottage, you can't help but think about what lies beyond, how different your meals are from the feasts inside the manor house. You've never sat at the Lord's table, of course, but you've seen glimpses through open doors on errands or heard gossip from servants. Roasted meats glistening with fat, trays of spiced pastries, white bread as soft as clouds, wine poured like water, sweetened with imported sugar or honeyed mead. You picture nobles tearing into venison, dripping grease onto linen, while you gnaw on a salty strip of pork stretched thin across a week. The comparison stings, and you smirk bitterly, muttering, "Their leftovers could feed my family for a month." Historians still argue how stark the divide truly was, whether peasants were constantly starving or simply lived on a different scale of abundance. You know the truth from your own eyes. The gap between your rough, dark bread and their delicate wheat loaves is as wide as the distance between earth and sky. To them, food is pleasure, variety, indulgence. To you, it's survival, ration, and prayer. There's a quirky tidbit whispered among villagers that some lords keep entire swans roasted on golden platters, their feathers reattached to make them look alive again. You laugh at the absurdity, imagining yourself trying to refeather a chicken just to impress your children. They giggle at the thought, and you all share the joke even as your bellies rumble. But it isn't only about what they eat, it's how they eat it. Nobles dine in great halls, music playing, candles glowing, servants rushing with platters. You sit in a smoky cottage, slurping broth by dim firelight, hopping mice haven't chewed through your stores. They lick honey from their fingers, you scrape porridge from the bottom of the pot. They pour wine into jeweled cups, you drink weak ale from a cracked wooden mug. The contrast is so sharp it almost feels like two separate worlds, the same land. Yet envy only goes so far. You tell yourself, with a wry grin, that at least you don't have to choke down snails or fancy sauces that mask meat gone bad. Your food is plain, honest, humble, even if it's monotonous. You joke with the children that nobles probably get bellyaches from eating too much, while you stay lean and quick. They laugh, though you both know which side of the line you'd rather be on if choice existed. Sometimes those scraps trickle down. On feast days, the Lord's servants toss bones and crusts to villagers. You remember once gnawing the marrow from a deer bone, rich and savory, so powerful it made you dizzy. That memory stayed with you longer than the marrow itself. For a week afterward, even your turnip stew seemed brighter, as if that taste had blessed your tongue. The unfairness of it all lingers, but so does resilience. You know you'll never dine on golden platters, but you also know hunger has taught you resourcefulness the nobles will never understand. They don't know how to stretch a cabbage across 3 meals, how to brew bark tea when water runs foul, how to spin stories that make children forget their emptiness. That skill, you remind yourself, is its own kind of wealth. Tonight, as you lick the last of your stew from the bowl, you raise it in a mock toast toward the manor hill, whispering, "Enjoy your swans, my lord. We'll enjoy our survival." The children clap, amused by your bravado, and you laugh too, because laughter, like bread, is what you cling to. And even if nobles feast while peasants scrape, you've learned that dignity is not always on the plate. It's in the endurance of the ones eating. The snow outside lies heavy and silent, blanketing the fields that once shimmered with gold in summer. You sit by the hearth, chewing slowly on the last of your bread, the taste sour and earthy, but you eat anyway. Because as you swallow, you're not just eating food, you're eating centuries of habit, tradition, and survival passed down through countless winters before you. Every crust of bread, every boiled root, every sip of weak ale carries a legacy. You think back on all the meals that have kept you alive this season. The hard rye loaves, the endless porridge, the salted meat hanging in the shed, the cheese wheels agging slowly, the roots pulled from cellars, the handfuls of nuts and bark teas foraged in the forest, the rabbits caught in snares, the fish pulled from icy streams, the rare pinch of spice or taste of honey, the feast days that lit up the dark, and even the famine foods that humbled your pride. Together, they've been less a menu than a map, a rough guide to surviving the months when nature herself seems set against you. Historians still argue whether peasants thrived on these diets or merely endured them. Some say the calorie counts were surprisingly high, others insist malnutrition was constant. But you know the truth in your own bones. Survival was never about numbers on parchment. It was about creativity, about making bark into bread, stretching stew with water, and finding laughter in the thinness of broth. It was about onions for beans, cheese for stitches, for so no one starved alone. There's a quirky saying in your village, "Winter doesn't kill, it tests." You smile softly at the words, knowing how true they feel. The food may have been plain, repetitive, sometimes bitter, but it was enough to keep you alive until spring. And in that, there's a quiet triumph. You lean back into the embers and let your thoughts drift. What you eat doesn't just fill your belly, it shapes your world. It teaches patience when bread must be rationed, resilience when stew runs thin, gratitude when honey sweetens the tongue. These winters have carved into your very culture. The songs you sing about bread, the charms you mutter over porridge, the jokes you tell about bacon tougher than boots. Centuries from now, people may not remember your name, but they'll remember the survival, the diet of peasants who endured the cold with stubborn grit. The children curl against you, their breaths warm, their stomachs quiet. You stroke their hair, whispering a joke about nobles choking on their feasts while you, the clever peasant, still stand strong. They giggle softly before sleep claims them. In their dreams, maybe they taste swan or sugar, but in waking life, they will learn, as you did, that rye bread and cabbage stew carry their own dignity. You sigh, content in the knowledge that though the food is humble, it holds stories, laughter, faith, and stubborn hope. That's what survival really tastes like. And as your eyes grow heavy, you think of the fields thawing in spring, the green shoots pushing through, the promise of another harvest. The cycle will continue, lean winters, hard bread, laughter, and endurance. Now, as the tale quiets, let your breath slow with it. Picture yourself lying not in a smoky cottage, but in your own bed, warm and still, blankets tucked close. The snow outside drifts softly, muffling the world, and the harsh winds are only whispers at the edge of hearing. Imagine that same peasant hearth, but no hunger now, only the gentle crackle of fire, the soft glow of embers casting calm light against the walls. You feel the rhythm of survival slowing into comfort. The bread, once hard and sour, melts into memory. The porridge, once endless, becomes soothing in its familiarity. Even the salted meat and cellar roots soften into reassurance, proof that enough is always tucked away somewhere. The laughter of children around the table fades into a low hum, steady as your own breathing. Every detail of those winters, the scraping of bowls, the smoky rafters, the little charms whispered over food, begins to blur. They're no longer struggles but stories, and those stories fold into a long, deep quilt of history, heavy and warm, wrapping around you. Each crust of bread eaten, each rabbit caught, each cup of ale drunk is a thread in that quilt, carrying you gently toward rest. As you sink into that thought, let yourself feel safe. The hunger is gone, the cold is softened, and you are wrapped in the same endurance that carried countless souls through centuries of winters. You've walked their path, felt their hunger, shared their laughter, and now you can lay it down. The fire crackles one last time, low and steady. The snow outside falls quieter, softer, until it feels like silence itself is blanketing you. Your eyelids grow heavy, your breath long and slow. The story lingers, but only as a whisper, fading into calm. Sleep now, rest in the knowledge that survival in the end is not only about food, it's about spirit, resilience, and the quiet warmth that carries you through the coldest nights.